up, man?
Welcome,
Thank
finalmente.
you.
Welcome to the Museum of Graffiti Daily Artist Talk. It's good to see you, Dash.
Likewise, bro. Likewise. You looking good.
I wish I had one of those cool mohawks you have on. Hey, Dash, so thank you for joining us. We're excited to have you on because you're a man of a really interesting history between Miami and New York in terms of your history in graffiti, and currently you're in Dubai. How are things in Dubai?
Pretty, I don't know. It's pretty calm here compared to what I see going on in the news everywhere else, where you're at. And New York, they kind of jumped on it early here, and, they locked it down pretty thorough. But even with that, 2 months into it, the cases are starting to pile up, and, the numbers are going up, but
I'm glad you're staying safe and you guys are healthy. So Dash, as we begin this, I want to just turn this over and just read your bio. I won't say your government name. Dash, born in 1971, is recognized for large-scale minimalist paintings and is distinguished as one of the premier graffiti stylists expanding into the contemporary space. Harnessing the intimate relationship between written language and the illustrated word, he examines how visual messages are imposed on and positioned in and experienced in the built environment. His work is characterized by an interest in spatial analysis, linear exploration, and the sensibility of architectural order. He employs a reductive formalism that articulates the coordinate plane through proportion, frequency, and contrast. His work, meditative and transformative, functions as a modern lingua franca and conveys the urban vernacular with an imbued bareness that engages one's sense of self, place, and time. Pretty powerful words to describe your work. And where we're going to start with everyone is on those thoughts, right? On how the reduction in your work plays such an important process that connects you back to your original story. And one of the things we have here, and this is a mural you did in Miami, correct?
Yeah, that's the 2017, I think, Art Basel.
Right, and so what's really interesting about all this work is we've had long discussions about this, about the macro inside of graffiti style writing and lettering. And this is an analysis, right, of that, a deeper analysis. Why don't you tell us a bit about this kind of minimalism in your work?
Well, so for me, this is, it started really in college, studying graphic design, and particularly in the web design situations, creating the wireframes and dealing with the viewport in sections that had to scroll. And so when I went into school, I was trying to be the guy who was going to rescue graffiti from being exploited by whack art directors and people who didn't know anything about it, and they were making it look silly on products. But during the time I was at school, I kind of changed, I kind of changed direction, and I realized that I didn't want to do that. I just thought that it didn't even belong in advertising. And my approach was to try to like sneak it in instead of beating art directors in the head with it. Oh, let me do it in graffiti. I just decided that I was going to take the aesthetic that fit for the architecture of the project. And what that meant in many situations was that I saw an overlap between structures in design and architecture and other constructs that were already part of graph, and we had been doing them for years. And so I didn't really need to reach too far. I just had to stop thinking about logos and signage and things like that, and look at the architecture of the letter form. And so I got stuck on this kind of what you're looking at on the screen there, the division of space, right? And at first it was that crack. Some people call it a digital crack, a cut segment. I know phase two called sandwiches, but that little extra half a sandwich, little, half little rectangle there that you see, everybody does it. Everybody who's been piecing since the late 70s has done that in their piece. And most people don't know who did it first, don't know why they do it. They just know that it's like a little addition to the cut segment in the letter. So I started calling it as a joke a half sandwich. And I studied it and I researched it in many people's pieces, my pieces, everybody I learned the piece from. Everybody does it, going all the way back to Kel and before. So it just dawned on me like that, how much, tension there was every time I went to cut a letter when I was doing an outline. What's the perfect place to cut that letter? You can't do it too close to here or too far. It's got to be like this balance, like this rhythm of where you're going to place that cut. And then which side are you going to do the rectangle on? And then if you commit to doing the cut, then you can't put a chip because the cut and the chip, clash until later years when people came out with a solution for that, which I, eventually adapted from myself too. So that division of space, that articulation of that bar connecting two letters or a long extended portion of a letter is where that took place, like where that thought process took place. So when I first started painting canvases based on graffiti pieces, I was doing letters because, before me, Doze was doing letters and A1 was doing letters and Dondi was doing letters. So I took to doing one letter on a canvas. But a lot of people, were doing it. Writers before me, everybody had done letters on canvas, were graffiti writers. So I didn't want to do something that had been done already. So I wanted to figure out a way, how am I going to figure out a direction that still is rooted in graffiti, but doesn't look like something that you did or, Dondi did or Futura did. So I studied first what people did before me, what I liked the best, and I sort of looked at how far they went, where they took a turn, where they could have gone further, what they didn't do.
Right, and
And
that's a good. If I can just add to
yes,
interject for a second, because we spoke about Mondrian, right? And he's an
yes,
interesting guy in terms of how he was blocking out spaces in his compositions. Again, he had a pattern, right? And it seems to me that you were dissecting your own pattern and again breaking it down to simplest elements, but in compositions that actually were both provocative of graph, but of early minimalism, right?
yeah. Actually, when I got to school in my first design principles class, the teacher was a Bauhaus junkie, and so I got a good dose of education on the Bauhaus and all the different designers and artists that came through there. And at the time, this was the mid 90s, a lot of what was going on in graphic design was people following sort of David Carson and like the grungy, sort of anti graphic design trend that was going on there. And so when I was at school, a lot of the students were latching onto that and just kind of, piggybacking on that. And, it was kind of like whack to me. It was too many people doing it, And on the other hand, you had people that had come from graffiti, ex-writers, whether they were good writers or whack writers, they had gotten a Mac and gotten into design, were going with I'm going to try to stick graffiti into my graphic design, or I'm going to try to stick graphics into my pieces on walls. And then that got caught up in a corny state itself. And then a look that a lot of people jumped on was what my man Alan Raven from 12 Ounce Profit was doing. And also Wayne, what Wayne was doing with Writer's Bench, a lot of guys were imitating those two vibes that were writers, and regular civilian graphic designers were imitating the grunge. So I kind of rebelled against that and went all the way back to the Bauhaus, like the simplest terms, and I was using Futura, and I was using Helvetica, and trying to just give it a little hint of something from graph, but I didn't want to commit to graffiti letters. So that's where I started picking apart the letter, and that was sort of a Kandinsky maneuver where he distilled the idea of an illustration and broke down every aspect of an illustration. So I started doing that with pieces in Photoshop in layers, putting putting the outline on one layer, the filling on one layer, the graphics on one layer, and then you could turn the layers on and off and look at just the outline or just fill-in or just the graphics. And where it drew my attention was to just the graphics. So a lot of the early things I was doing was just based on graphics, like the chips or the squigums, as Dondi called them, or like the FBA new wave fill-ins. Just that without the letters. So at that point, it was treading on kind of what Futura was doing, which a lot of writers from my generation, we thought Futura was doing fill-ins without a piece. It turned out years later, we found out Futura was doing something completely different based on his experience in the Navy. But at the time, we didn't know that. So a lot of writers were trying to do that, like, just nice fill-ins on a canvas. That's going to be nice. And in fact, in '88, I had done a wall in Miami like that with two or three of my friends. We did a whole wall mural. Actually, it was the first post-graffiti mural in Wynwood, right down Biscayne Boulevard. And it was just a whole wall of fill-ins. It was the Futura concept, but it looked different because it was our particular style of fill-ins, and there was 3 or 4 of us. And, and it was cool, and it was the first of its kind. And that's when I really started thinking of graffiti in abstract terms. But then after that, I got a little bit into the gallery scene. In the 90s, I kind of walked away from it and got back into it in the mid-90s through graphic design. So I kind of studied art history through the lens of a design student rather than an art student. So it took me some time to come back around, because in the 90s, you were one of my mentors, and Kel was. We thought everything was going to be digital. We thought the future, the output was digital. So we didn't really think of painting some of these compositions we were making on the computer or on black books.
No, and if I could just say this, is that when we look at these works, and you mentioned this before, when you were talking about working digitally and doing architectural site maps, this is also reminiscent of that in some way, right?
Yes.
When you're doing these architectural site maps for development.
No, absolutely, because that's where I first kind of landed on the concept. If you look at that paint, like what's in the picture right now, when I was designing interfaces, it was like you have your header, you have the body, you have the footer, and you scroll up, you have a sidebar. So that layout in wireframe always just looked like you had zoomed into an outline, particularly that part of the letter where you cut the letter. You know, so I just found it intriguing that of all the writers who had dealt with abstraction, nobody thought to elevate that humble, common, ubiquitous thing into the subject of the painting.
There's a reason why, right? Because it's deduction, and graffiti is maximalism, right?
Correct.
And that this kind of thinking is of a different generation, right? And
Absolutely.
what you're doing is basically kind of imposing your narrative on that theory and the hypothesis that some of these guys were building back in those days about form and space and structure. And it's weird because you and I have talked a lot about this really innate nature in style writers to understand abstraction and deconstruction and constructivism in a way that isn't with the same kind of analysis as those that started making these works. You know, it's what we do is kind of add what you call the ism, right?
Yes.
And that
Yes.
ism continues in the conversation. And what's interesting, you have two things going on in the body of your language. This very rigid, um, you know, really structured, geometric graphic design style painting based on what you were saying, both the graffiti and the wireframes, but also the line work, right? These juxtaposed next to the painting we're looking at, there's one that's on the left that's gray with some black horizontal and vertical blocking out. But the painting on the left is strokes. They look like brush strokes, but they actually aren't brush strokes, are they?
No, the painting on the left is done. That's what I call the marker paintings. They're done with the unis, the uni wide, the mini wide, and the flow pens. And that those paintings came a little bit later, but the way that they came about was that the compositions are all the same. Like that painting is filled in with the markers, but it easily could have been a painting just like the one next to it. So they they're basically the almost like the sketch, the napkin sketch for the hard edge paintings, right? And if you look at a lot of my notebooks and my random, you know, everybody knows I doodle a lot on Starbucks napkins or whatever, right? So those ballpoint sketches with, you know, on that napkin paper, it's like the cheapest paper you could find, but it had the ballpoint has a nice drag on that paper. When you do these little thumbnails, and I do hundreds of them, and they're tiny, right? And when I go to shade in the areas, I just do lines. So when you know, at some point it dawned on me, like, man, like, you know, they start deteriorating over time. You're touching them all the time. They're in your bag. They start falling apart. So I decided that I wanted to take those sketches and paint them. And I started doing them. Is that me or you, bro?
No, go ahead.
No, you know, those doodles were just the layout for these other hard edge paintings, and I started to do them, and I quickly realized that, you know, I'm not a brush guy, right? Painting so many years with a spray can, I hadn't touched a brush since the '80s, since like Lee jackets, right? So when I started painting again in my garage, I had to stop using spray paint because my son was born and my wife was, you know, home, and the fumes were getting up in the house. So I started to use acrylic, and I just hated using brushes, so I started using rollers. And then when I started using the rollers, it was cool, but it ain't, you know, it was limited what I could do. So I was just doing the hard edge paintings with tape and rollers and acrylic and a little bit of spray paint for the details. So one day I ran into a situation where, you know, I had to use color. I was trying to use blue, and I couldn't get a clean coat. And it's because, you know, the pigment's transparent. But as a writer, we never dealt with transparent colors with paint. We wouldn't even bother to take them off the shelf. We left them. We wanted solid colors that would cover whatever was behind it, right? So I freaked out and I started calling everybody, yo, what's wrong? You know, I can't get this blue to cover. I got like 10 layers on it. It still looks, you know, blotchy. It took me a bunch of phone calls, and finally, I think it was maybe Reese who solved my problem for me and explained the pigment to me. But in the meantime, I had to I had to stop painting because I didn't want to ruin any more paintings, right? So in the meantime, I was talking to West, one day, and he tells me, "Listen, I know how you are. You're very, you know, precise with with the way you want your stuff to look, but this is canvas. It's different. You're not gonna get on the wall, on the canvas what we've achieved on walls with spray paint over the years.
Well, let
Why
me
don't
stop you
you?"
there on that thought, because if you look at this series, from the one on the left is yours. It's from the ligature series, correct?
Yes,
And then next to it is a Franz Klein painting. And again, it almost feels like it's trying to tackle the same problem, right? About
absolutely.
expression and marking. But one of the things that you're saying is that how do you bring the particular type of marking to painting, to canvas, in a way that probably you hadn't done before?
Well, so what happened is that all the years that we painted in the street, I never thought, I never considered surface. It wasn't a factor. The spray paint goes over everything. So we didn't, I didn't care I didn't have to think about the surface. It was different every night, right? So when I started painting canvas, the first thing I noticed when I started doing the tag series, I put down the hard edged paintings for a minute at Wes's behest, and I started doing paintings with tags. But I was using sponges and all kind of different things I was making in the studio, and it just felt fake. Like I would never write on a wall with a sponge or write with a roller. So I decided that what was the problem was the texture of the canvas. And if I was going to do tags, I wanted to do them with a marker. The markers
Right.
aren't going to behave on a canvas the way they're going to behave on plastic or vinyl. So rather than fake it like some people do, where they project a tag and then color it in, or they just do it with a brush and it doesn't really have the flow of real handwriting, I decided to deal with the surface. So I started to prep the paintings, and then prepping the painting started taking longer than the painting itself. But I got the surface to be non-porous, and that's what I decided was the common denominator between the inside of a train or the signage in front of a store that you
Right, and
would hit with a marker.
that also dictated the tools you would use, because you went back to the old pens, the old markers, the uni wides and the mini wides from Japan's. Like what we see
Right.
here, we see one of the marker paintings, but we see your hand with the uni wide. It's really cool because I guess you put the blue down first, and then you came back with the black to overlay on top of it.
Nah, it's actually the opposite. Like
Is
all
it?
those paintings, I do them black and white first, and then some of them I leave them black and white. But some of them I give them a glaze. So that that blue situation came about because of what I was saying before when I ran into that pigment problem about transparency. It kind of stumped me. Like I didn't know what to do, and then I was thinking like I never had to deal with it. But at one point, it dawned on me that we did deal with transparency in graffiti. It just wasn't with paint; it was with ink. So with all the ink on the insides, you would see translucent tags, and so that was the aha moment where I was like, okay, so I'm not gonna run from the transparent blue. I'm gonna embrace it. And so I started to research about techniques, and I went back to like an old Renaissance technique with the glazing, Caravaggio and Vermeer, and those were like the masters of that technique. So I learned what they did, and then I did it, except instead of doing a grayscale underpainting of you know the Last Supper or whatever, I just did whatever I wanted, which was tags, or which was the lines with the T squares. And
It's
so
one of the things that I like about these is the one, I think more than the minimalist of application is the theory, right, that you're building behind them.
Sure.
with the tools, with what the lines represent, but also that, again, you're bridging uh, a movement, a minimalist movement, with a contemporary urban art movement. And like we see here, like the rock tag is kind of wiped out. It's interesting in that parts of it, the drips, while the tag looks like it's behind your stroke, but the drips bring it forward, which is an interesting little play on this white striped canvas. So in
Yeah.
terms of you, again, going this route with your work, Dash,
Yes.
and in the contemporary urban graffiti space, what are you hearing? What kind of feedback are you getting behind doing this kind of conceptual minimalism?
I mean, I've gotten a lot of positive feedback, especially since I got on social media. I kind of was avoiding it for many years, and then I finally gave in and got on Instagram and started posting.
Are you finding this kind of work more challenging than your traditional style writing and graffiti?
Yeah, I mean, everybody likes when I post pieces or tags or characters or whatever. That's cool. But at first, when I was posting a lot of the hard edge paintings, there was cool feedback, but not as much as when I started posting the marker paintings. For whatever reason, those paintings, they kind of, I don't know, they resonated with more people. Um, and the first people to kind of get on board with it, to my surprise, was graffiti writers, like bombers, like street bombers, inside bombers, um, which I thought that was cool because, in the 90s, so, like sort of like bombers and guys who piece, there was a big divide. There was a loss of respect after the trains because the guys who piece sort of went to legal wars and the bombers stayed bombing. So for a lot of the bombers to hit me up and be like, yo, that's dope, and they were the first ones to feel it. And then after that, it was kind of like everybody, and then civilians, like people from the art world,
Yeah.
people, you know
Well, like
regular people.
that's one thing that's really nice about them. For us writers, the textures evoke familiarity for us, right? Environments, train tunnels, walls,
Exactly.
uh, things like that. These works, I really especially like this series that you did with gold. Uh, tell me about these pieces.
That's from a series that I call Industrial Lightscapes, and that's when I took when I started doing these glazed pieces. They were first on paper with ink, and that was the big deal for me was that it was the actual tools. It was the real markers that we wrote with. Every graffiti writer who bombed in the 80s and the 70s has a shoebox in their closet with markers they never threw away. I had that shoebox, and over the years, they went from the shoebox to a shelf to my desk. They made it to my office. I started bringing them into meetings. I would put ink in them sometimes. So it was important to me. Like after all those years, they were like little trophies on my desk. And then one day I put them to work first with watercolor on paper, and I used them as a dip pen because I couldn't put watercolor into the uni, and those unis were old and dried up anyway. So um, it was kind of about the marker first. It was kind of about like recording the mark. One of the first drawings I made was called oh man, what did I call it? It was the unmistakable uni-wide mark, and it was just a square done with a uni. Like the uni's 40 millimeters wide, so I did a line going 40 millimeters down, so it made a perfect square. And that was just like a lesson in economy of motion, and it was a drawing, but it was writing at the same time, and it was just mark making an industrial mark. So that's where the industrial lightscapes comes into the title, And the lightscape comes from the glaze, the transparent ink that gives it the sort of backlit, uh, Renaissance effect, which I thought that was cool when I fell into that, because a lot of 20th century artists sort of rejected all the Renaissance painting. And I'm not into figurative painting, but the techniques that some of these guys had was, you can't front on that.
I would agree
amazing.
that they're tried and true.
Yeah.
And so these,
So
go on,
yeah.
to
Oh,
finish
no, no.
talking.
So I just brought that into my realm. At first with these paintings, I was just kind of recording the mark of these uh, sort of famous markers, because everybody could have a marker in their pocket, but the guy who pulls out the uni wide, it's like you're wearing a tuxedo. It's like you're immediately the man. And if you got Flowmaster in it, better yet, right? So I started making these, I call them paintings, but they're technically drawings, with the unis, with the Flowmaster, with the Marsh ink, all the original tools. And at first it was just like, I'm going to do it till they run out, till the ink runs out. And then that's it. It's almost like a recorded historical document. And that was it. But then, being how I am, I started to implement patterns and, layouts. And I started just treating them sort of like, like I would lay out a page in a book. And that's where my graphic design background comes in too. And so I got another series with those markers too, called Master Pages. And they're based on different canons of page layout, right? So, I don't know, it just sort of fell into place, and then I wanted to go bigger with them. And then I developed a pattern based on the happenstance that the uni is 40 millimeters wide, the mini's 20 millimeters wide, and the flow pen is 10 millimeters wide. So there was a geometric progression going on that I could continue. And if I wanted to make the paintings bigger, I could just expand on that progression and make the bigger markers, like homemade, but instead of being made out of brushes, they were made out of felt, and so that's kind of how I expanded. From there, they jumped to canvas, and then in canvas, the criteria became the surface, and getting the surface, to be compatible with the marker, because you wouldn't take a uni wide and write on a rusty, train on the outside. You wouldn't write on a bench where all the paint was peeling off, because you would fuck up the tip. You might do that with a Magnum 44, but not with a mini or a uni. So the uni and the mini, they're like the Cadillac of markers. So they had a certain prestige, and so I wanted to prep the surface to be the actual type of surface that you would use that marker with. Not that I'm going to run out and buy plexiglass or vinyl. I just treated the canvas in a certain way where it had the same criteria as I would write with on a surface with those markers.
It's a reverence. Obviously, it's a high reverence, and you have to have a worthy surface for that tag.
Absolutely.
I understand that from writing with uni wides. The smoother the surface, the more exhilarating the experience.
Sure.
So Dash, I thank you for sharing all that. It's amazing, and I'm glad you did, because it will give people insight as to how to look at art, particularly your art. But I love how you explained conceptually how we could potentially look at your work, and while you don't see the quote unquote graffiti, it's already baked in. And so thank you for that analysis. It was thorough. And so, but I want to go back to, how, because what's interesting is that you go from minimalist to complete maximalist, like in your graffiti, you throw everything in it. This is a very old Dasher drawing. I want to talk about the early days with you in terms of what's shaping your ideas before you get analytical and developing an art history, awareness.
I mean, the piece you're talking about here, I think it's from 87, 86, 87. It's torn out of a black book. It's cut out of a black book. At this time, man, I was like 15, and kind of just stumbling around graffiti. You know, I could piece, but I wasn't, you know, like a rock star yet at the time. But I was kind of just basing everything around what I saw on the trains, you know, growing up, and pictures I took from, man, before I even ever tried to do a piece. I was benching trains in like 83, 84. Um, and so I was sort of developing my style along the lines of what was going on the one line at the
But you
time.
originally you came from Miami originally, correct?
I was born in New York. Um, I kind of been back and forth my whole life, but in '86 I moved to Miami for good, like to stay. I had been in Miami in '85. I actually went to school in Miami in '85 for like a semester, um, and then you know before that I was there summer '84. Like I said, I've been back and forth my whole life. My parents split up when I was 5, so from that point forward, I started going to Florida regularly.
And so there was
But
already an established scene by the time you got there in terms of
um,
the early
it
graffiti. I would,
by '86 it was crazy. It was full on. Um, it was no joke. It was incredible. '86 to '88 were the best years in Miami, in my opinion. '85, when I was there in '85, it was happening, but it wasn't. I wouldn't say it was huge. And '84, summer of '84, it was more. It was there, but it was really more a hip hop scene, more the b-boy scene, and there was writers, but not a lot. You know, there wasn't, and not a lot of people were piecing. You know,
how common
but
was it to find a New Yorker in Miami in those days?
it was, you know, not like it is now. You could tell, you could just tell though. Back in those days, that you know, they didn't have MTV raps and music, you know, videos where everybody got the same style, the same weekend. You know, back then you would go out and people would just come up to you like, "Yo, you from New York? You from New York?" That's my man Seam. That's an SE piece in his old black book that I have.
Right, and you painted with, was he one of your first partners?
Seam was one of my longtime partners from '86 forward. Um, I met Seam through Drip, my man Drip, who was actually my cousin's boy. I had met Drip in '84. He went to school with my cousin, summer school. I don't even think he was writing yet. I think he was just a popper, right? He was a b-boy. And then him and his brother used to break, and we battled, and we were cool, you know. And then when I saw him again in '86, now he was a big time writer, and then he was down with VO5. So I bumped into him at a Run DMC, LL Cool J, and Beastie Boys concert, and he was with the crew, and I met them, and you know, a week later we connected, and we got down. Like they put me down. Seam and Porky and Drip and Sneak, those were all my boys from that point forward,
So
you
in
know.
that, in those early days, in terms of, you know, Miami's development, one of the things I see in this picture, you can clearly see how influential the Chrome Angels was in terms of the style. No, it seemed,
Uh,
it seemed like that book was having a big influence. So
in what I'm not sure I know what you mean. Are you talking about the letters or the characters or what?
yeah, yeah, the whole feel, that the style, the type of style that was changing, because it seemed to me that this was a real period where that style, particularly that book, you know, had so much influence, and I'm wondering if it had that kind of influence that I'm assuming on style writing here in Miami.
I mean, the book definitely influenced a lot of people. That was happening sometimes blatantly. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think the most influential thing that came out of that was technique. The way people started doing certain fades and and painting the characters in, you know, and more of the backgrounds. I don't think as much in letter forms or at all, you know, but for painting technique and for backgrounds, I think that that whole idea of being able to do something realistic versus cartoony was attractive to guys who were into that kind of like Boris or Frank Frazetta's kind of style of painting.
Yeah.
Maybe
Tell me,
gravitated toward that.
yeah, so you guys, you know what's interesting, you know, in New York we had layups and tunnels and yards. Here you had the pennants. Tell us a little bit about that. Like some of these pictures, you know, kind of show, you know, what they may have looked like, but give us an idea of what a pennant looked like in Miami and what it represented.
So the pennant, as I was taught, right? I heard the first time I heard of the pennant, I heard it referred to as the Hall of Fame, like the Miami Hall of Fame. Then I started hearing people call it the pennant, and so you couldn't really tell if it was pennant, like the Yankees won the pennant, or that meant that like you had to win the, you know, you had to be the best
Right.
crew to be able to paint there, or but then somebody said no, it was going to be a penitentiary. It was an abandoned building near Fontainebleau Boulevard, where, you know, the neighborhood that spawned a very important artist of our times who's in the chat right now. But anyway, that building was an abandoned building. It had been abandoned apparently since the 70s, and kids just started going in there to do, you know, general mischief, you know, smoke weed, break bottles, hang out or whatever. And then at some point, people started writing in there, you know, and it was one of the first places when graffiti hit out there in that neighborhood. That's where people went to peace, kind of undisturbed, because once you were able to get in without getting spotted, it's like being in a tunnel. Once you're in there, you're good. And people started doing pieces in there. Those pieces in this picture, some of them are from '84. That's when the first pieces started getting done in there. And then it's, you know, people started finding out about it, and it, you know, got around, and people would go every day, every week in there to do a piece or to see who else did a piece, and go in there and take flicks. And people, you know, had beef in there. You might bump into writers in there, and
Right.
you know, somebody was getting robbed. So it was basically the same law or lawlessness of a layup or a yard, except it was in these buildings. You know what I mean? And then at some point, there was another building, smaller building, but the same scenario, an abandoned construction site. And it was near the airport. It was smaller, so they were calling that one the airport pennant or the baby pennant. And it was the same situation, just, you know, a couple of neighborhoods away. And that's actually, that building, the smaller one, is one of the first pieces in Miami was done in that building by a b-boy from Rhode Island who was down with a lot of New York crews by the name of Oz Rock. Rest
Yeah,
in
no,
peace. He did a piece in there. Oh, that's the mural we did in '88, the abstract mural. Oz did a piece in there that said Galaxy for my man Steele, who was an early Miami writer, first generation Miami writer from '83. That was his crew, Galaxy Funk, and Oz helped him do the piece. Anyway, so at some point, every single building that would get abandoned and writers would go in there, it started becoming a pennant. And everybody, oh, this pennant, the Miami Beach pennant, the Hialeah pennant, the, you know, North Miami pennant. So everywhere where there was a construction site abandoned and you could go in there and paint became known as a pennant. And that's like a phenomenon that I only have ever seen in Miami. Like, I know LA has the yards, and I've never been to one, so I don't know if it's like a freight yard or back of a store or whatever, but it's that scenario. It's a place where graffiti happens, you know, where people go there to write.
One of the things you shared with me where graffiti did happen was this pool that you guys painted for Bonnie. Tell us a
Yeah.
bit about this project, because you mentioned it was just 5 different crews on this one project.
Yeah, I think it was 5. It was a few crews. Bonnie Bonnie's a cool lady that we met. I forget who met her first, but she was an artist. She was a muralist, and she was kind of like our version of Henry and Martha or Ruza Blue. You know, like she
Yeah.
saw potential in these kids that had talent, and she was a muralist, so she understood that she understood the idea of painting on walls, right? So she tried to round us up, a few of us, and she would connect us with gigs, or she would kind of act in a way as our mentor, as our manager. But this was her house down in Cutler Ridge, and she was like, "Oh, I want you guys to come paint my pool." So we showed up. She had the paint, but what we didn't know when we showed up is that other crews were going to be there, and some crews had beef with each other. So it was a crazy day in her pool, um, you know, inches away from violence. But at the end of it all, it was all good, and everybody
Nice.
rocked. Everybody did their thing. But her idea was she wanted to express different, different slogans talking about art. Like, this is art.
Right.
Art is here, art is there, art is everywhere. So I don't remember people, we drew names out of a hat. I know me and Scene, we got stuck with art is there. So that's the one that we did. Other crews, I think MTW crew was there, DFC crew was there.
So I want to talk about crews for a second, because you are part of some of the most well-known and most elite crews in the game. And one of the things that I kept running through these images, seeing, oh, he's FC, IBM, he's down with COD, TC5 with Rock, and one of the things that I came across, which I really liked, was that you paid homage to FBA. This K's TC5 with this, is that a shark character? Is that what it is?
Yeah, that's a shark character by Tack
Tack.
from '82. That's the Sabin K's whole car, arguably one of the dopest whole cars ever painted.
You want to know? I happened to be there that night.
I think you told me that before when Knock did the next car. Knock was doing a car that night, and you were with Knock or something like that.
So this kind of connection to FBA, tell us about that, because that's important in the Miami story, right?
Yeah, well, so I'll tell you how it went down, right? Airborne left New York in '81 at the pinnacle of his writing career, moved to Hollywood, Miramar, just north of Miami. So he was out of the scene for many years, and everybody would always wonder what happened to him. So in '95, I was moving back to Miami, right? I left New York for a couple of years when I went to school, and K's, he was like, "Yo, you gotta find Airborne. You could find him." He just believed in his bones that I could find Airborne, and I was like, "Well, I don't know how I'm gonna do that, but I'll try." So I hit up Seam, and I told Seam, this dude Airborne, he lived in Broward, and we vaguely remembered somebody mentioning Airborne's name in the '80s as having been down there, but we couldn't pinpoint it. But by the '90s, a lot of leftover b-boys and writers from the '80s were starting to come together. You know what I'm saying? Like, because there was hardly nobody left, so the people that were left were trying to revive the scene. So Seam had connected with our man Jamar from BB Love, a crew in Hollywood that in the '80s we had like a shaky relationship with, but by the '90s it was all good. It was squashed, and Seam and Jamar had come together on a breaking tip, and Seam mentioned it to Jamar. Jamar was like, "Yo, I know who could find that dude." He called his man, and before you know it, we had Airborne's number, right? And as a bonus, we didn't know that Spade had also moved to Florida a few years later. So Spade and Airborne, they never lost touch. They were best friends from childhood. So we were looking for Airborne, and we got Spade as a, as an extra bonus. So when I got to him, and I hadn't even landed in Miami yet. By the time I landed, Seam had already hooked those up, connected with those dudes. So then when I met him, you know, then I told him like, yo, everybody in New York is wondering what happened to you. FBA kept going, K's kept FBA going, and FBA had a whole second generation with writers from FC that got recruited, and now, you know, through Serve and other members, we're doing walls, and FBA lives on. So those dudes bugged out, like they couldn't believe that,
Yeah.
that you know, what they
And what's
started was still
important,
going on.
yeah, Dash, one of the reasons I say I bring that back to the Miami story, because you have contributed to the museum, you curated the Miami section. And it's really important to kind of fill in those blanks, right? How this all connects, right? And there's an airborne photograph of one of his trains in the museum that Henry Chalfant took of one of his trains, and it says, "This is my last piece. I'm out." Right, and that was the period when he left New York, and
That was
next thing
the night. That was the night before he left New York.
right, and so then next thing you know, he's in Miami,
Yeah.
and you brought that to the show. So tell me about this. You know, while it's a small footprint and it's hard, you know, to get, you know, everybody's story in one room. Tell me about this process, right, of how you decided to go about telling the story of Miami in this display.
Well, so I knew the space was limited, so I wanted to kind of do an overview of the chronology of Miami, because what I'm always kind of getting upset about is, you know, there's scenes that are much younger and there's scenes that are much older. Now, Miami had a scene before the media blitz came out. You know what I'm saying? Like when Beat Street and Subway Art and all that came out, even Star Wars, Miami already had a scene, right? And so there's a lot of people, even people in Miami writers who weren't around that far back, they kind of don't even know that, or didn't even know that. So I wanted to dig deep. I'm a history buff, right? And at the same time, so, you know, if you apply that to graffiti, I'm also a graffiti history buff. And so I need that connection. I need to dig, because I need to, if I'm involved in something, it's just, that's my interest. I read books, I research. I'm like an anthropologist for graffiti, right? So because of social media and because, you know, our network is so deep as writers, I have like a Midas touch, digging people up and somehow bringing some people back into graffiti.
Name some of the people you brought back to the exhibition.
So for this exhibition, you got the Block Boys. They've been around, but the thing is, you know, Block Boys are an important crew that I felt they hadn't gotten the respect they deserve. You know, when I was down with VO5 and I was 15, Swift and these guys were like 20, and they were kings where they were from.
We have 2 minutes. Let's do a quick roll call of some of these guys.
So in that exhibit, right, in the timeline, I had the first writer from Brooklyn that moved to Miami and bombed as early as 79 and 80, a writer from Brooklyn called Nas, Nas, and he had tags still when I got there in the mid 80s, from the early 80s, right? Then you got Airborne, who came down in 81. You had my man Cool C, aka Carlito Machete, who came out in 82, did some of the earliest pieces in Miami, and influenced people. Did the first jean jackets in Miami, where it's hanging up there, the rich jacket.
You know, some of these guys, when they came into the exhibition, were deeply moved. They come with their families. They're very emotional about this whole experience, that you remembered them. And that's one of the nice things about having that particular piece there, because some of these hometown heroes have access to be put in context to this other bigger, wider story that comes out of New York.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They deserve it. Some of those guys are guys from New York, the early transplants. So I wanted to focus on the early transplants that came, and the guys that they met, that physically they met. So yeah, the early Miami guys who didn't learn from Subway Art or Star Wars, guys like Steele, who was influenced directly from Cool C in the flesh.
Sure.
Guys like